Welcome to the Whistleblower Newsroom. I'm Christina Borgeson. When it comes to examinations of third rail issues, perhaps none are more dangerous than those done by historians who understand the importance of deep dives into the past for context. My guest today is one of Europe's most distinguished historians, well known for his bombshell book titled NATO's Secret Armies, Operation Gladio, and Terrorism in Western Europe. Dr. Daniele Ganser's book is an expose of NATO, along with the CIA and intelligence agencies of other Western nations, collectively operating a terrorist criminal enterprise called Gladio to eliminate communism around the world during the Cold War. Has this criminal enterprise continued to exist up to today? Did it expand its activities to serve new agendas? What's past is prologue, Shakespeare wrote in The Tempest, and well aware of that, Dr. Ganser has also looked into a more recent terrorist event, 9/11. He's here today to talk about how his research into Gladio brought him to the subject of 9/11 and what he uncovered. Welcome, Dr. Ganser.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your show.
Talk about Gladio and what it was and what NATO and the intelligence agencies, the Western intelligence agencies, were doing.
Gladio is a secret operation which was uncovered in the year 1990. So it's already 30 years ago that it has been in the public domain. But unfortunately, during these 30 years, most historians have not really looked at it. It's been a little bit on the sides because the data has been scattered in different languages, some of it in Italian, some data in French, some data in English, some data in German and other languages. And if I just can take you back to the year 1990, that was the year when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And after that, we had Operation Desert Storm. And obviously, like tons of books have been written about that war, the Kuwait War. But Operation Gladio was also uncovered in August 1990 when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti said there is a secret army in Italy. It's a secret army within the Defense Department, and its name is Gladio. So that was a bombshell because actually in a democratic society, you should not have a secret army. You should just not have it. I mean, secret means the parliament doesn't know anything about it. The journalists don't know about it. And the taxpayers don't know anything about it. And, you know, you shouldn't have that.
So he discovers this. And then all of a sudden, all the other Gladio participants in the other countries start running for cover.
It was really embarrassing. I mean, Giulio Andreotti is a very high-ranking politician. He was the acting prime minister in Italy, and you know he had been around for many years in different functions in the Italian government, and people knew that if this old fox, as they called him, confessed to something so delicate, you had to pay close attention, because he said he did not only say we had a secret structure here in Italy, but he said, and other countries had this secret structure too. So the Belgian defense minister at the time happened to be in Italy. Guy Coem was his name. So we're still in the year 1990. And Guy Coem said, is there a secret army also in Belgium? And then Giulio Andreotti told him, yeah, sure there is. Why don't you fly back to your country and check with your chief of staff? So with the highest military officer in his country. So Guy Coem flew back to Belgium and asked his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the highest military officer in any given country, and said, is there a secret army in Belgium that I know nothing about? And then the chief of staff said, yes. And then he said, I'm the defense minister. Why don't I know about it? And then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said in Belgium, well, you know, the defense ministers, they come and go. We can't trust them all the time. So this is a very secret operation. And the French said, oh, no, we didn't have that, of course. That, you know, that's just an Italian scandal. And maybe, you know, the Belgians, they have their strange political structure. We didn't have that. And then Giulio Andreotti said, no, these secret armies were linked to NATO. And at the last meeting of the Allied Clandestine Committee, they had like a secret structure within NATO that you wouldn't even find on a normal NATO chart. They had a meeting, and the French also took part. So then the French were embarrassed and said, "Oh, yes, true indeed. We also had a secret branch of that network." So it was all very, very embarrassing, and spread on from there to London and Washington.
Well, now we have to be clear about something. NATO is basically, and was back then too, controlled by the United States, right?
Oh, yes. NATO was founded in 1949. Today it has 30 members. The US is the most powerful member with 750 billions in defense spending, and total NATO defense spending is like 990 billion. It's very clear that the US is running NATO. So the highest ranking military officer in Europe, the Supreme Allied Commander, has always been a US general. You can go through the list.
That means the US can instead of going itself and looking like a huge aggressor, the US can use NATO as the tip of a spear for any operation or, military advancement it wants to make basically anywhere in the world.
I mean, that is true.
And what's also interesting to me is that NATO was supposed to disband after the Soviet Union, right?
Yep.
Let's talk about what actually Gladio was. It was a network of operatives, military spies, dirty tricks, whatever operatives in these countries, in all these communist countries, basically trying to overthrow their governments and install not even necessarily democracies, anything but communism, basically.
That's an important point. Until now, we've just made everybody familiar with the term Gladio, and that was a scandal in 1990, so 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. But I've not yet explained what actually the secret armies were. In European countries like Italy, France, or Germany, they were part of NATO. They became members of NATO. But the US, which are in charge of NATO, they feared that in some of these countries, like, for instance, Italy, a communist party could come to power. That is very important for people in the US to understand that in Italy, you had communists who were part of the political game. I mean, after the defeat of fascism, the communists in Italy were very popular because they had been fighting Mussolini, the Italian dictator, during the Second World War. So socialists and communists were popular in Italy. Now, the American CIA wanted Italy as part of NATO. So after the Second World War, they said, we need to get Italy into NATO. But they did not want the communists in NATO, because if we just think through their heads at the time, they thought, gee, if we have an Italian defense minister who is a communist, he's gonna spoil all the secrets of NATO and call Moscow and tell them what NATO is doing next. So we don't want that. So the strategy really from an American perspective was, yes, we have the Europeans in NATO, but we have to make sure that in Italy and other countries, the communists will never gain executive function. Executive function means if you have a defense minister position, for instance, or a prime minister or a president, that's really high-ranking executive function ministers. They can sit in parliament, and there were a lot of Italian communists sitting in parliament, but they said, we'll never have them in the executive branch. So they set up these secret networks and trained them in the use of explosives. They gave them ammunition, they gave them guns, they gave them money, they gave them gold, they gave them communication equipment. And the storyline was, and I think the data really proves, the storyline was that these networks would become active as a so-called guerilla, as a network
Guerrilla
of secret,
network. Mhm.
yeah, guerrilla network in case of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Now, if I put myself in the head of these guys who were planning the whole thing during the Cold War basically from 45 to 1990, these guys, also in Switzerland, I have to admit, some of them were convinced that a Soviet invasion could come. Okay, it's now really far away for teenagers who might be listening to our communication. They go, why did they fear a Soviet invasion in Western Europe? They did. I mean, that's proven. They feared such an invasion. And in my country, I'm now in Switzerland, and Switzerland was not part of NATO. Even in Switzerland, they had a secret army. It wasn't called Gladio. It was called P-26. And it was also uncovered in 1990. And people in Switzerland were like, wait, we didn't know that. And how can that be? And what did they do? And they had these arms caches in different places of the country, in the Alps and in the forests. And in Italy, they even had these arms caches on cemeteries. Just, they had arms deposits on places nobody knew. And they had communication equipment. So,
and did the US provide most of these arms?
Yes. The British MI6, so that's the Secret Service of the British, yes, and the American CIA were actually in command of the whole structure. They said, let's have these secrets stay behind. The overall term in international history is stay behind networks, because the idea was a guerrilla network which stays behind enemy lines. So you have a Soviet invasion, the agents go underground and they are then behind enemy lines. If the US then fights the Soviet Union, they would capture, shot down pilots and bring them to the shore, bring them to safe houses, etc. So that's the military term, stay behind. And Christine, the fact is undisputed that these secret networks existed. That is undisputed. They found the arms, they found the explosives, they had military commanders who spoke out and said, yes, we were linked to NATO, and yes, we were trained by the CIA, and yes, we were trained by the MI6. But they would never admit that they were linked to terrorism. Their storyline was, yes, we prepared for a Soviet invasion, but this invasion never came.
Well,
so basically nothing happened.
One man's terrorism is another man's liberation army, right? Terrorism,
that's it.
So this is,
you name it.
So okay, so the Soviets did not invade. Soviet Union collapsed. What
1991,
happened?
Yes.
Yeah, what happened to all these stay behind operations?
Well, first of all, people had to understand that they existed. So these structures became known only in 1990. And 1 year later, I mean, just for people to remember, in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed. So that was the end of the division of Germany. Then in 1990, Germany was reunited. Also, again, to younger listeners in your show, Korea today is split in two. There's North Korea and South Korea. And during the Cold War, Germany, which is neighboring country to here in Switzerland where I am, Germany was split in two blocks. It was Eastern Germany and Western Germany. And so in 1990, Germany was reunited and is now the most powerful country in Europe. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was very shocking also for the Germans to understand that they had these secret networks. And in some cases, they had right-wing extremists in these networks, because the CIA had recruited former people of the Hitler army, who after the Second World War were still very anti-communist. And just to make sure that the mindset of the people was anti-communist, they took people who had actually been under Hitler's command. And the most famous guy of all of them was Reinhard Gehlen. And the Americans made him the commanding officer of the first German Secret Service. So, all these things have been covered in secret, and people, didn't want to talk about it because they wanted to say we have functioning democracies in Western Europe, and in Western Europe, you'd never have a secret structure.
Right.
You just don't have secret armies in a democracy. It's like, it doesn't go together. And even NATO, NATO in November 1990, they first said, no, this is not true.
They lied about it?
First, the
Oh.
spokesman came forward and said what Giulio Andreotti, prime minister in Italy, has just said, that NATO has secret armies, is not true.
Oh.
And then, very embarrassing, the next day they had to come forward again and say, oh, what we said yesterday was not precise, but we cannot comment on it. It's top
Yeah.
secret. So they messed it up as far as communication was concerned. And thereafter, they had all the NATO ambassadors coming together, because the ambassadors didn't know anything about it. And so the military high brass had to inform them that they had a secret structure. And they obviously ran back to their governments and said, why don't we know anything about it? And there was Supreme Allied Commander, an American general, John Galvin, who informed him. And he then insisted, okay, it was just purely defense, which is not true.
The Soviet Union falls apart.
1991.
No need for NATO anymore, right? Because that's why they were formed in the first place, is to go after, to protect all these countries against the Soviet Union. So now what happens? Why doesn't NATO disband?
Because from the US perspective, it was very interesting to push NATO closer to Moscow, and to encircle Moscow. Because from an American perspective, there were just two challengers. There was China today, the number one challenge, and Russia, the biggest country on earth. Russia, just from the surface, is the biggest country with 150 million inhabitants, not so many. The Chinese with 1.4 billion inhabitants, the country with the most people. So that's a real challenge. And NATO did not disband, but they did the opposite. They pushed and took new countries into NATO. So they took Poland in, they took Estland, Letland, Lithuania, the Czech Republic. They took Romania, Bulgaria. They just expanded towards
And
Moscow.
So now the threat now is still Moscow, and
Oh, yeah.
and the threat has been expanded to China.
That's it. The Soviet Union collapsed, but NATO, instead of dissolving, got bigger. Because it was just in the American interest. And maybe, if I may add, NATO then had the 50th anniversary. In everybody's life, when you get 50, it's an important moment. When NATO turned 50, that was in 1999, they bombed Serbia. So that is really bad behavior on your 50th birthday. But that's what they did. I mean, they had, for the entire history of NATO, they've said, we're a defensive alliance. We would not attack another country first.
First of all, their secret armies prove that, or their secret networks prove that that's not true. But okay, so formally,
but that was secret. That was secret. Nobody knew that. They tell
the world we're defensive, and for the first time, they go on the offensive against Serbia. And how do they explain that? How do they explain it?
That was the time when Bill Clinton was in charge. He was president of the United States. And in Germany, you had Gerhard Schröder. He was from the Social Democrats, and Joschka Fischer from the Green Party. So Bill Clinton basically said to the Germans, and now we're going to bomb Serbia. And the Germans participated. It was the first time that Germany went to war after the Second World War.
How did Germany sell it to the German people? What did they say?
With propaganda. The trick was, they said there are concentration camps. That's really what they said. It's very scary, but that's how you can really mess with people. They said there were
concentration camps?
That's what they said. They said there are concentration camps in Serbia, and the Serbs are killing the Albanians in these concentration camps. Therefore, the Serbs are really evil, and that's why we have to kill the Serbs. And people in Germany, when you mention that word, concentration camps, they go crazy. I mean, it's their own trauma, because they have killed the Jews in concentration camps. So it's a trauma. And, Christina, the problem is there were no concentration camps. It was just a lie. It's like with the US, with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was just lies. So they bombed Serbia in 1999, and it was clearly illegal. I mean, Clinton had no right to bomb Serbia. Think of Serbia bombing the US in 1999. Everybody would have gone, that's illegal. And the Germans, they were just fooled, totally fooled. And then the population was misled. And I give public talks in Germany a lot, because I'm based in Switzerland. I speak German, and I traveled to Berlin and Munich and other cities in Germany, and also to Austria. And
so what do you
people are starting to wake up about these things.
What was the real agenda in bombing Serbia then?
The real agenda was really to have a NATO party for the 50th birthday and to show everybody else that they're the strong guy in the room. I mean, they even bombed the Chinese embassy and said, "Oh, sorry, that was a mistake. We had an old map." That's what they said.
Wow. Wow.
It's a show. It's a show of force.
What I find interesting is you've pointed out that if we go up to 9/11, you've pointed out that actually the invasion of Afghanistan is a NATO invasion.
That's it.
That the invasion of Iraq after that is a NATO invasion. And you talk about, what are the other countries? There's Serbia.
Libya 2011 was also, it's NATO countries taken together because.
And Syria.
Syria, yeah.
NATO. And it's interesting because I don't think people think about it in that context.
No, most people get it all messed up in their minds because they think we're the good guys and we're fighting the bad guys. That's how they see international politics. They don't see the details.
Well, it's just so interesting because it's now clear to me from what you're saying that NATO is sort of a US-controlled international tip of the spear for military operations for any number of reasons, whether it's Serbia is a show of force, Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, you tell me, what is Afghanistan an attack? Let's get to 9/11.
US started the invasion of Afghanistan on 7 October 2001. So that's now more than 20 years ago. And the story there was, we have to go there because Osama bin Laden is there and he's really evil guy. He's a terrorist and he's to blame for 9/11. So that was the story. And people today don't, it's all in a blur and people don't really remember what happened. But if you go back to
remember that Osama bin Laden was an ally of the United States against the Russians in Afghanistan.
That has been canceled out of many history books. None of my books. My books are not, most of them are not in English, but my research shows very clearly that the CIA, after the defeat in Vietnam, after the US Army was defeated in Vietnam in 1975, they wanted to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam. So Brzezinski, who then was National Security Advisor to President Carter in the 70s, he said, why don't we support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan? And people go like, what? The CIA supported radical Muslims? Do they do that? Of course they do. And what was the idea? The idea was to then draw the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. And this really worked. So in the summer of 1979, the CIA started to support in Afghanistan radical Muslims, the Mujahideen. And that's actually the same people who later, the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda network. So just radical Muslims who oppress women and all these things that the West would say, we'd never do that. And so the Soviet Union then invaded in December 1979, and they fought, which was illegal. I think the Soviet Union had no right to invade Afghanistan, but they were scared that, the Mujahideen would get stronger and everything. So the CIA supported the Mujahideen, the Soviets fought in Afghanistan, and in the end, the Soviets lost. In 1988.
But what was the real interest? Because, I've heard people say oil, for example, the oil pipeline was an important aspect to why the US would even want to do that. And I remember I was working at a network at that time. I was working at CBS Network here in the United States when I pitched a story to 60 Minutes because I think it was Unical, these oil executives from Unical wanted to hire the Taliban, this group of.
They met with them in Texas.
Right.
Oh yeah, they flew them into Texas
to protect this pipeline route that they wanted to build across Afghanistan. And of course, if you look at where the U.S. military installations were set up, after 9/11, when Afghanistan was invaded, it's right along the proposed pipeline route. So there are all these other hidden agendas going on all the time that end up destroying countries, killing a lot of their citizens.
These two wars in Afghanistan, the first one I was talking about is from 1979 until then 1988, and it was the Soviet Union which invaded and lost. The Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan. Gorbachev, president of the Soviet Union, admitted defeat. They had to withdraw. There was like 1 million people killed. And during that time, as you said before, the CIA supported Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan because they were fighting the Soviets. So that's chapter 1, okay? And then you have the whole 90s that go through, and then you have 9/11 on 11 September 2001. And after that, you have the second war in Afghanistan, which starts on 7 October 2001. And this second war in Afghanistan, it has this element of pipeline wars. It's in there because in the 1990s, as you rightly said, the Taliban were in charge in Afghanistan. And people were looking at the map and saying, gee, there's a lot of oil and gas in the Caspian Sea. But the Caspian Sea, if you look at it, is landlocked. In the north, there's Russia, and in the south, there's Iran. So UNOCOL and everybody else in US, for sure, didn't want pipelines to go through Iran. They didn't want pipelines to go through Russia. So there's only one way. You can go west through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia. That's one route. They built that pipeline. That's done. And you can go east, and then sooner or later you hit Afghanistan. So yeah, the pipeline story, the Tapi pipeline, is part of the reference
and it's
there.
Still going on.
It's still going on. Yeah, still going on. And the other idea of the US obviously was to just keep the defense spending very high. I mean, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was no enemy. I mean, who was the enemy? So they came up with this idea: radical Muslims are now our enemy, and that main narrative, was really installed on 9/11. They said, radical Muslims are dangerous. They attacked us in New York, and that's why we have to hunt them in Afghanistan. And, this narrative influenced Europeans as well, because the German Bundeswehr, after Hitler was defeated, they said in Germany, we're never going to ever have a war again. We're never, ever going to have an army. Then they said, oh, wait a moment, we're going to have an army, but it's only going to be for defense purposes. And we call it the Bundeswehr. And then they said after some time, well, defense is good, but we actually have to fly and participate in the war that the US is fighting in Serbia. So they participated in the war in Serbia. And after that, the US said the German army must come along when we go to Afghanistan. So crazy as it sounds, Germany fought in Afghanistan. They did, and they were defeated. I mean, they came back together with the US now just last year.
Well,
but
it was the Germans, and the Brits were over
there. The French, the Brits, the Australians were there.
NATO was there.
That's it.
It was a NATO war. You're absolutely right. But of course, controlled and started and so on by the United States.
We have 193 countries, and 30 out of these 193 countries are in NATO. And NATO is the biggest military alliance on the planet. And people don't really understand that NATO has a lot of influence on international politics, and the US is in charge. We've already gone through the bombing of Serbia, 1999, including the bombing of the Chinese embassy. We've gone through Afghanistan, which started in 2001. And to understand it, really, we have to talk about 9/11.
What do you know about 9/11 that we should know?
The important thing about 9/11 is to understand that it led directly to the Afghanistan war. We cannot understand Afghanistan if we don't look very closely to 9/11. And the main narrative that we got about 9/11 is full of lies. And this is very hard to understand, but it's about time we talk about it. Like, what are the lies? Most people, if they think, oh, what happened on 9/11, they remember a plane hit the Twin Tower, another plane hit another Twin Tower. These two Twin Towers were both in Manhattan, in New York, and then the Twin Towers collapsed. So for most people here in Europe and also in the US, it's plane, plane, tower, tower. That's it. That's 9/11. And then Bush coming on
Well, there's
TV.
also the Pentagon attack.
Yeah, but that's already fading away in memory, or
Right,
Shanksville. People
right.
don't even remember that. But what has really left an imprint is the New York Twin Towers and how they collapsed, and the planes.
Right.
That's the essence of the. It's a very, very visual narrative, by the way, and televised all over the world. And the important thing to remember is that it was not 2 towers, but it was 3 towers which collapsed on that day. And this is something that I was always very astonished that people don't talk about the 3 towers, because once you go into this 3 tower narrative, you go like, gee, if you have 2 planes, why did 3 towers collapse? I mean, what was this 3rd tower? And the 3rd tower is World Trade Center 7. And this 3rd tower was just a block away, so it was very close to the Twin Towers. It was also in New York, in Manhattan, and it came down in the afternoon. So it collapsed at 5:20. The others, the Twin Towers, were down before noon. Okay, so this other tower was with a delay of several hours, but on the same day went down. And I've looked at this in much detail. And first of all, I was shocked, that television stations here in Switzerland, also in Germany or in the US, would always just focus on the 2 towers. And I was going like, why don't they show the 3 towers? And then I went through the different media records, and I found that the BBC, which is very famous still, had reported about the collapse of World Trade Center 7. So I was very relieved, and I thought, at least the BBC has got it right. There are 3 towers. And it was Jane Stanley, who was a journalist at the time, reporting it. And then I found out that the BBC had reported the collapse of the 3rd tower 20 minutes too early. She reported that collapse at 5 o'clock, but it collapsed at 5:20. Now people go, Daniele, you're so into details. I mean, it's just 20 minutes too early. I mean, come on. But then I go like, how did she know? And there was a lot of talk about this in Great Britain about that, and Jane Stanley had to take a stand, and she is not to blame because she had just a teleprompter in front of her, and she read this from the teleprompter. She says, the World Trade Center 7, the Salomon Brothers building has also just collapsed, and they had that in the 5 o'clock news, so they could not take it out anymore. It was there, and then later, I think it was 2008, she admitted it was a mistake. And of course, it was a mistake. And then, this whole controversy.
Well, who gave that information to the BBC?
They said they had it from Reuters.
Oh, they got it from Reuters?
That's what she said.
At Reuters? I mean, did anybody ever follow that line? Like who at Reuters got the information and from whom?
No, they had to have a story why they knew about the collapse. And they said, well, we don't know, and it didn't happen. And then researchers, 9/11 truthers in the UK, pushed the BBC and said, on September 11, 2001, you report in the 5 o'clock news that World Trade Center 7 has collapsed, but that's not true. It was still standing. It collapsed at 5:20, so that's 20 minutes of fake news. And then they actually came out with a special BBC series. I think it was called The 3rd Tower. And then the head of BBC World News had to say, yeah, we're sorry. And Jane Stanley was on camera, and she said, yeah, I was wrong. It was a mistake.
The building was right, but you could see the building behind
That's
her.
it. Oh, yeah. It was just, but she didn't know. She didn't know.
No, okay, she didn't know. But then where did she get that information from? And where did whoever gave her the information get the information from, et cetera, et cetera? Nobody has looked into that?
Nobody knows. Wow, no, it's one of these stories which are totally shocking, because I think she can be left off the hook because she was just doing live reporting on a crazy day.
Yeah, she was just reading the prompter. But
it was the prompter.
Okay.
Then that leaves you to BBC in London, because they were feeding the prompter, and then from there they had the excuse, we had it from Reuters. But Reuters, they never said who. You need a name, otherwise it just blurs out, and then Reuters would have to take a stand. But that has never been clarified, and it's one of those issues. But if we leave that apart, then I went to, here in Switzerland, I went to academics who specialize in building safety, architects, engineers. And I showed them how this 3rd tower came down, and just came down in 7 seconds, symmetrically. There was zero resistance. The building just went into the ground on its own footstep, and it went against, the density of the building. So it didn't, go to the side. And if you just stand up tall and you try to push somebody down, that's the hardest thing. You push a person to the floor. You can push them to the side, but through the density is really difficult. And then I really followed this data because I had worked on terrorism and strategy of tension and false flag terrorism, which is peculiar part of history I focus on. But then I said, I want to know more. I want to know everything about World Trade Center 7. So I looked at the building data, and the building has 79 steel columns. So these are very strong columns. And then the question was, if the building goes down like that, they have to go at the same second. It's not one is still standing for a minute or for 10 seconds. No. Otherwise, you don't get the symmetry. They have to go at the same second. So the question was, what energy can make that steel column 79 lose their strength in the same second? That was the research question. And then the National Institute for Standards and Technology said, we're looking into this. This is really complicated, and we're working in it. And they came up with a report in 2008 and said it was a fire.
They called it thermal expansion. It was a new term they came up with.
It was total nonsense.
That office fires heated up the steel so that it got soft.
Yeah, they said, it was a girder that would push off its seat, at the column. Obviously there's steel, horizontal steel and vertical steel.
Yeah.
And they interlink in a building. I mean, I'm a historian. I've never built, a steel construction. I've never done that, but I talked to architects and they explained it to me. So you have the steel columns, 79 like that, but then you have many more like that. And then the NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, said, at column 79, girder 201 came off. It just expanded due to the heat, and then it came off, and that led to the total collapse. And then I said, but how come? I mean, even if that is true, which it isn't, but if it was true, there's still, more than 60 columns standing intact. Why would they just go away in the same second? We need some coordination here. So my personal story was that in 2005, I think, or 2006, it was, I went to architects here in Switzerland teaching structural safety, and they're responsible for safety in Switzerland, and we don't have many big buildings like you have in New York, but they told me this is controlled demolition. There's only one way. You just have to blow it up, otherwise you can get it down. And I said, can I quote you in that? There were two. I always need two sources as a good historian, and they both agreed, and they were very experienced, very well-read professors at the National Institute for Standards and no, not at the National in Zurich, in the ETH Zurich, and I showed them the video. They didn't even know that a third building had gone down. They were also in this limited vision.
Yeah, that's so fascinating.
And then I published it. They said, you can quote us on that. They said, just add the word probably. Then I wrote probably brought down through controlled demolition. And their name was Jörg Schneider and Hugo Bachmann, Swiss engineers. And then the American embassy reacted here in Switzerland and said, Daniele Ganser is spreading conspiracy theories. This is just nonsense what he's talking about. And then my university got under a lot of pressure, and they told me to shut up. That was the story.
They just told you to shut up?
Yeah. My boss
give you any reason? Did you say why? If it's true, why?
No, I mean, my superior, like I was teaching at university at the Center for Security Studies at ETH in Zurich. And I was a senior researcher there. I already had my PhD, but still at every university, you have hierarchies. So I had a professor, Andreas Wenger, who was one level higher. And he called me up and he said, you can't say that we were lied to on 9/11. I said, why not? And then he said, this is going to get us into a lot of trouble. And why, it's why question it? I mean, Bush said, Osama bin Laden did it. Who are you to question this? And I said, I'm Daniele. I'm just, like the little girl in this novel who says that the emperor is naked. I'm nobody, but I can think for myself that we've not been told the truth. First, BBC reports this too early. Then they say it was fire. I can see that it was not fire, and I'm able to say it. And then they said they even shut down my emails. That was crazy because I was doing such a lot of communication work. One day, my mails were not working after I'd published that article about World Trade Center 7 in German in a Swiss newspaper, which is called Tagesanzeiger. I think it was in 2006. But it was one page, and, the title was The Bitter Debate About 9/11. And that was, the Afghanistan war was still going on. And I was saying, NATO Article 5, which is the collective defense clause, has been activated for the first time after 9/11. They said it was an attack from abroad on NATO. So NATO has the right to retaliate. I mean, that's the whole historical pattern. NATO Article 5 has never been activated before. So I looked at it and said, yeah, but you cannot self-activate NATO by, carrying out strategy of tension in one country, which means you manipulate terrorism and then say somebody else was it. That would be a self-activation. And I said, we need at least a debate about it. And I thought, we're neutral Switzerland, we can do this because Switzerland is not part of NATO. But then my professor said I should.
I just want to be real clear about what you just said. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
You just said that based on the fact that based on seeing that the narrative for Building 7 was a complete lie.
Yeah.
Are you saying this 9/11 was a false flag operation? So NATO is activating itself based on a false flag operation. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that we were lied to about World Trade Center 7, and I'm convinced that World Trade Center 7 was brought down through controlled demolition. That's what I'm saying. And if you have controlled demolition on 9/11, you can leave everything else apart. Just World Trade Center 7, to my opinion, was brought down through controlled demolition.
Yeah, but what is the connection to NATO? What you were saying about NATO self-activating?
I say NATO said we will only, become active under the Defense Clause 5. There's a NATO charter which says if one country is being attacked, for instance, if in 1950 the Soviet Union had invaded West Germany, then all NATO countries at that time promised if one of us is attacked, that means we're all at war. And that was the idea behind NATO. If you look at the history of NATO, it was a collective defense mechanism.
Okay.
It's like if 5 guys say you attack, or 10 guys say you attack one of us.
Attack my homie, I'm coming at, we're all coming after you.
That's it, we're coming at you.
I got that.
That's it.
Okay,
so that is called the defense clause. Okay.
And that was activated after 9/11.
For the first time. It has never been activated in all of 50 years of NATO's history. When NATO bombed Serbia, they didn't claim Serbia had attacked NATO before. They didn't say that. They just bombed Serbia and said, it's illegal, but we don't care. Okay, that was 1999. But 2001 is 2 years later. It's much more interesting because their NATO said, yes, we are attacking Afghanistan, but we are retaliating. Okay, we are retaliating for terrorist
attack. For our homie, the US, who was attacked on 9/11.
That's it. Afghanistan, did not attack the United States. As they didn't send Afghanistan planes and soldiers to the US and bombed it. What we have is we had a terrorist attack in New York. That's undisputed. 3,000 people killed. That's the biggest terrorist attack in history. Jesus. Okay. We have to look at big terrorist attacks to understand what's going on. There's the Pentagon, there's Shanksville, but really it is about the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7. So then I zoom in on that and say, okay, give me Manhattan. Okay. Give me Ground Zero. I want more details. And then I see on this story, they attack Afghanistan. Then I say, wait a minute, you cannot do that. You must prove before you self-activate NATO, that the attack came from Afghanistan. They could never do that. So I say they self-activated it. They said,
okay, because the controller of NATO is the United States.
yes,
The President of the United States, George Bush,
he said,
right,
we have a right to go after them, and we also have a right to go after the government who protects them. And then the story was, the Taliban in Afghanistan protect Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is responsible for 9/11. Therefore, the US has every right to bomb Afghanistan. And, you know, people, it happens so quickly. You know, it's like one of these tricks of Copperfield or so. You know, if it happens very quickly, people have a hard time to follow it up. But as a historian, I'm in no hurry. Okay, I go back and say, is it true that on 7 October 2001, the US invaded Afghanistan? And the data is clear. It is true. Then I say, is it true that that was less than 1 month after the 11th September 2001? Yes, less than 1 month. Easy to calculate. And I go, so in these 3 weeks or so, were they able to come forward with a convincing case at the United Nations Security Council? But that's the place where you have to bring your case. That Afghanistan was responsible. They couldn't. I looked at the Security Council records, and of course, the US ambassador went there and said, we have been attacked by terrorists. So the whole world community condemned this and said, that is absolutely wrong. You know, terrorism is illegal, and, you know, we're with the United States in condemning this act of terrorism. Then they gave the United States the right for self-defense, but they did not say what country, okay? Because then if you want to take self-defense, you have to prove to the world community that the other country that you've chosen is responsible. They could never bring that. And they
you think the UN specifically made sure not to not to say what specific country the US could go after? Do you think they did
because
that
there was no
purpose?
data. Yeah, because there was no data. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, when the United
the US
States
pays the UN's bills too. I mean, let's face it.
That's it. But I mean, the UN Security Council, you have France in it, you have Great Britain in it, and you have the US. These are 3 NATO countries. So 3 out of the 5 permanent seats in the UN Security Council are NATO seats. And then you have 2 seats, which are China and Russia, and they don't want NATO in Afghanistan, okay? Because Afghanistan is too close to Russia and to China. There's a common border between Afghanistan and China, if you look at the map. So the Chinese surely didn't want NATO there. And the US said, yeah, it's a clear-cut case, but they could never prove it. And to bring it back to that question that you asked, how did NATO self-activate itself? They just said, we have the proof, but we can't show you the proof. We cannot show it. You know, we have the proof that Osama bin Laden did it. But where's the proof? It was just a story. And people then asked, you know, Osama bin Laden, did you do it? And he said, no, I didn't do it. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. People didn't want to hear this.
Well, and actually, there were others who offered to bring Osama bin Laden to,
trial.
I mean, and the US wasn't interested. So
not interested.
So let's look at this though in a big picture, we're here now situation, because basically now NATO has just turned into, I mean, it's still operating, it's still operating in an illegal fashion, and it's doing it on a bigger scale. And it's doing it as a tool of the United States, basically.
Yeah, NATO is the tool of the US to control Western Europe and get
and the rest of the world, basically, now that they can go anywhere. So if you're an investigator, if you're a lawyer investigating 9/11 and you're looking for the culprits, then NATO has the culprits to not only the 9/11 crimes, but the follow-on crimes to 9/11, which are these invasions of these countries. Yeah. Then NATO is also a culprit.
Oh yeah,
of
for me,
9
clearly.
of 9/11.
You know, people don't want to hear it, but I say NATO, you know, is not being investigated at all. At all. You know, people just go, NATO, they confuse it with the United Nations because it's just an international
Yes,
organization.
they do.
That's the first thing. Then I go like,
It's
gee,
the
that's if
North
you
Atlantic
treaty organization.
Organization.
And it's a military organization which calls itself defensive. But it clearly is offensive.
It has become, it's activated itself as an offensive tool now, an offensive military organization. It is
And it's a threat to world peace.
Controlled by the United States.
It's very important to just remember NATO is the biggest military organization in the world. And it claims to be defensive, but it's not. And that it's an offensive military organization. They also bombed Libya and Serbia. We didn't go into all these details. But I think if we could do one thing, we could prove in this conversation that we need a frank discussion about NATO.
We need an investigation of NATO.
Yeah, we do.
I mean, you started it from back then, but the new engagements that NATO has taken on require more digging and more, because if, as you say, Building 7 to you proves that there's something other than, oh, Osama bin Laden and his people did all these amazing crimes.
They couldn't blow up, you know, they couldn't blow up World Trade
States.
Center 7. It's impossible.
Well,
it's not the Taliban. They couldn't do it.
So the question is, because in order to blow up a building, you've got to put in those explosives and so on.
Yeah. And you
so
need insiders. You need
insiders. You need. So,
I mean, if Christina, if I may add, you know, there was the 9/11 Commission report written by Keenan Hamilton brought it out, but it was really Zelikow who wrote it. He's also a historian like me, I'm ashamed to say, but Zelikow really just twisted the narrative totally. And then I looked at this 9/11 Commission report, which is I think 400 or 600 pages thick. And you put in, if you have it as a PDF, you put in the World Trade Center 7. It is mentioned, but the collapse is not mentioned. So, you know, it's just mentioned at the side. And the problem is, if you don't, in the official narrative of the Bush administration, you don't even get the number of buildings right. And if that was, you know, a bachelor thesis of a student, 20-year-old student or 22-year student, I was the history teacher, I would go like, okay, this is your work. Unfortunately, I cannot accept it because it's 3 buildings that collapsed and you only write about 2. So 3 instead of 2, like, you know, this is like a mother who doesn't know whether she have 3 or 2 kids. It's like, it's not a minor thing. So the official report, the 9/11 Commission report, has the number of collapsed buildings wrong. And so that leads me to this call for people to think for themselves. And not wait for the CNN or the New York Times to bring, you know, this to their attention, because it's really only through independent media news outlet like yours that people start to think about it. They can check for themselves. World Trade Center 7.
Now, I just want to ask you one last question.
Okay.
You're a historian. You have seen the history of NATO from way back. Okay. I mean, the Cold
49
War.
it started.
Exactly. And now you see events, you see 9/11, and now we're, you know, a couple decades out of 9/11.
Ukraine.
Exactly. So what do you think is NATO's, and let's say the United States' agenda is?
It's power. It's always power in history, you know. It's like a chess game. If you can move closer to your enemy, then, you know, you're one step ahead. And they, in 2014, overthrew the government in the Ukraine and said, we're going to draw the Ukraine into NATO. That's what they wanted to do. And now Putin is just in December 2021. Putin came forward and he said, no, you're not going to get Ukraine. You know, you're not going to get it. Ukraine will never be a NATO country. And now we're in the year 2022, and we realize that Russia is also a nuclear power, and they say, stop, it's enough. You're not going to have the Ukraine. You're not going to draw the Ukraine into NATO. Because after the coup d'etat, which to my mind was a US coup d'etat in Ukraine, the Russians took the Crimea. They secured the Crimea because they have their ships on Sevastopol. It's a military base, a Russian military base. And Putin has a problem with his ships. You know, they're all stuck in the ice. They can go nowhere. So he really needs the Black Sea. And he said, okay, I want to have my ships in Sevastopol. And if you get Ukraine, then I get the Crimea. And it happened very, very quickly. And right now, as we speak, the tensions in Ukraine are very high. And it's just very dangerous. I think everybody should just calm down and relax and say, okay, Ukraine will not be a NATO member. We're not trying to draw it into NATO, because the Russians have already said they won't have it, and that would really relax the situation. But Biden is not saying it. He could say it. He could say, okay, Ukraine will not be a NATO member. It's too dangerous. We'll leave it at that. He could say that, but he doesn't.
But what about the idea of national sovereignty? I mean, what happens to that with an organization like NATO?
They don't respect it.
Well, they don't respect it.
No.
De facto, it doesn't exist. It does not exist, because if some big country decides it wants to overthrow your government or invade you or whatever, it doesn't matter how many treaties are there. It doesn't matter how many agreements. Nothing matters this is the world we're in now.
This is true. I mean, Christina, you're frank and outspoken, and that, you know, that's a fair analysis. That's how it is. I mean, check how the Vietnam War started. There was no right to bomb Vietnam. Think if we turn it around and think, in 1964, Vietnam started to bomb the United States. You know, they started with California, worked their way through Texas, and then finally reached Florida. People would go, that's wrong, because then you realize what's happening. But it was the other way around. The US bombed Vietnam. There was no right. It went from 64 till 75, 58,000 American soldiers killed. And then I'm very interested to understand what the soldiers thought. And one soldier, he later joined the peace movement, and he said, I had no reason to doubt my president's words, and I had no reason to doubt the New York Times and my teacher. So it's basically very few narratives that they follow. And if the president says we have to go to this faraway country because communism will otherwise, conquer the world, then they went.
The other question that 9/11 raises is the leadership of NATO, which is the leadership of the American government. If they are lying about this, they have an interest in lying about it, which means that they may have had, raises my questions about, well, did they have a hand in 9/11? So now what we have, which again, 9/11 is an operation, could be a secret, internationally done operation too. I mean, that's what people are looking into. And so here is a government that potentially has attacked its own people to pursue agendas overseas that obviously benefit greatly. War is a big moneymaker.
It's a moneymaker.
And
people, people have a hard time. People have a hard time to follow my thinking. But then I say, look at it from that way. If you're a soldier, a high-ranking soldier, you go to war, you're ready to kill. Now, obviously, you're also ready to lie if it gives you an advantage, right? If you're ready to kill, you're ready to lie. And then you will see that wars and lies, they come hand in hand. And once you work from this premise, then you go to, okay, when did the war start in Afghanistan? 7 October 2001. Okay. And then you go, you search for the lies. You just search for the lies. You say, there's got to be a lie somewhere here. Where could it be? And then you come to 9/11. And then you go to World Trade Center 7. This is a beautiful planet, okay? We live on planet Earth, and we're just having too many wars. It's just obvious, too many wars. And the victims are those who are being killed, but also the soldiers who come home are traumatized. We have a lot of suicides among the soldiers, and we owe it to the soldiers. They are in their 20s or in their, they're young guys. They have no clue about international politics. We owe them the truth.
We owe everybody the truth, because
True
without the
indeed.
truth, these top people, these people who plan these agendas and carry them out with no care for the average citizen or their lives, and using, by the way, insult to injury, because they use the tax dollars of the
Yep,
citizens around the world
they do.
to effectuate these wars and these whatever these murderous agendas. And this is what bothers me. I mean, that's why I talk to people like you, because you guys bring pieces of the puzzle. And so I want to thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a
Thank you for having me.
fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Christina. You have a great day, and thanks for your work for peace. It's very valuable.